Alright, Master Gardener trainees, let's start with part 2 of invasive exotic species, some identification and control. Most of this part of part 2 will be dealing with the control measures for these invasive exotic plants. Let's talk about control versus eradication. Unfortunately, people use the term control to mean eradication of these particular pests or particular invasive exotics. There is a big difference between controlling and eradication. Or when they use the term control, they're using it to mean eliminate it, get rid of it completely, corner to corner in the state of Florida. In most cases, this won't be possible. So here is a diagram I found several years ago online, and let's look at the invasion curve as it's been called here. Let's look at the left-hand side of the slide and see species absent. And the word is prevention. So in some cases we try to prevent some of these invasive exotic plants from getting into the country or into the state. That's why we have customs inspection of various things to prevent certain species coming from, let's say, Asia, since we import a lot of things from that area of the world, and it has in parts of Asia climate very similar to Florida or other parts of North America for that matter. So we're on the lookout for these to prevent the spread of whether it's a disease or an insect or whatever. But we won't talk about diseases and stuff in this section of Master Gardening. Then eradication. Look at that little block of space there on the curve. Here below, it's been introduced, and now there's a small number of localized populations. This is when eradication is potentially possible to eliminate an invasive exotic plant. For example, they have various experimental stations in the United States of America and in Florida, and they brought over various plant materials either for food, ornamental value, forage, erosion control, things on that order. Had somebody done something in a certain part of the state, let's say Central Florida, back 150 years ago when there were 10 plants that were all of a sudden becoming 100 in that 1 acre, and realizing that that was a problem, ripping them up, destroying the seeds, and maintaining that area free of that particular plant species. That's when eradication is possible. Containment. This is where public starts to begin to notice there's maybe a problem. We have a rapid increase in distribution, and with this abundance of plant material, eradication becomes very unlikely, and the public is just beginning to notice the problem. It has already passed the area or timeline for eradication. A lot of times where we're at with most of the invasive exotic plant species, whether it's Florida or any part of the United States of America, North America, Hawaii, it doesn't matter, we're looking at the long-term protection and long-term management. The invasive species are widespread. Brazilian pepper is widespread along the coast from Pasco primarily southward. In Florida, Melaleuca is widespread in the Everglades. Air potato is widespread throughout Florida. Skunk vine is widespread throughout Florida. Mexican petunia is widespread throughout Florida. Kogon grass is widespread throughout Florida, and many, many, many other plant species, some of which I didn't even talk about today. So we can do some long-term management or control, whether it's in our yards, public buildings, for example, botanical gardens, arboreta, sometimes state parks, and things like that. They'll do various things to control invasive plants like air potato. So by and large, what we're talking about for exotic invasive species is controlling them, not eradication when we talk about control. How can we control some of these things? Well, if it's aquatic and it's floating, I'm not sure exactly what plant that is. That could be, it doesn't really matter. Let's say it's even water lettuce. It's not. Sometimes the best way to get rid of it is to get it down by the waterfront and pull it out. That's a lot of work, but it doesn't need any sort of chemical application. It needs mechanical control. That's a nice way of saying hand removal, digging it up, pulling it up, cutting it down, etc. Let's look at the lower right-hand picture. Gentleman finds a tropical soda apple, one of them near the fence post like we saw earlier in part 1, and all he needs to do while he sees it is pull it up and immediately destroy it. No need for getting out a sprayer and spraying it with a herbicide. Brazilian pepper. Now that's going to be hard to control. That plant's been there a while, but it could be cut down and then managed to prevent the new seedlings from growing, which means more pulling. Now, a big problem with these various techniques of hand removal is a lot of these plants have what we call a seed bank. Let's look at the Brazilian pepper. There are tens of thousands of seeds that probably have been dropped in that area over the course of many years, as large as that particular Brazilian pepper tree is. So a lot of times removing it once doesn't yield the control that most people think it will. There's constant ongoing maintenance to keep these under control. So hand removal is best usually for small areas, your yard, for example, a small community garden plot or something like that. It's also probably best, of course, for vines because they're so intertwined with other desirable vegetation. It also is good for smaller seedling plants that are easy to pull up. It'd be harder to do it with a big tall tree like a carrot wood or something like that. If you are removing these plants and destroying them, do it properly. When disposing of invasive exotic plants that have the potential of spreading into nearby woods, water bodies, put them in the household garbage. The garbage is either going to be put in the landfill, depending on where you exactly live, or in parts of Pasco, it goes into the incinerator and is burned to turn into electricity. It is destroyed, in other words. Do not put it in with landscape waste that is going to be composted because most of the time the composting process of most municipalities is not designed to kill all the reproductive structures, seeds, roots, tubers, air potato bulbs, or any of that in the composting process. So keep that out of those kind of waste streams, put it into the garbage. And as I mentioned in part 1, if you have to move it off site and it's got seeds or berries, put a tarp over it so it won't drop seeds as you're driving down the public roads. Now there's biological control that's being used on some plants. Here we can see what is called the air potato leaf beetle or air potato beetle. Air potato leaf beetle. They feed primarily on the leaves. Look on the left-hand side of the two pictures here. Those are the immature air potato leaf beetle. Notice they don't look quite like the picture on the right. The right is the adult. As you can see, the adult is very red in color with a black body, red wings with a black body. Cute little thing, a little bit larger than a ladybug. The back end is a little more bulbous in nature, so it's not quite as streamlined as a ladybug, but very similar in appearance, and you might at first mistake it for a different species of ladybug, but it is air potato leaf beetle, and its food source is air potato, or Dioscorea bulbifera. Now this insect was brought over from Asia and done extensive testing to see if it would feed on any other vegetation. This particular insect is exclusive to the Dioscoreaceae, easy for me to say, right? In other words, the air potato family. It's a very limited number of plants grown in that family and few under cultivation. In some parts of Africa and Asia where air potato is native to, there are forms of these that are related and used as a sweet potato-like or yam-like food product, but these are different species of Dioscoreaceae than our air potato. Now, as I was saying, the picture on the right is the adult. The picture on the left are the immatures or the larval stage. Beetles, as you will discover in another module on entomology, have what we call complete metamorphosis. In other words, they start life out as an egg, then a larval form, and then a pupa, and then the adult. So they do look a bit different than the full-grown version, although the coloration is pretty close, but the immatures are more orangey in color and less reddish in color than the adult. Also, the immatures are voracious eaters, even more so than the adults, because they're kind of like teenagers and they're eating the air potato leaf out of house and home. You'll notice their feeding damage is primarily between the veins or interveinal. They eat the leaf and leave behind the, I guess, harder to chew or harder to digest veins. So you'll see air potato that's being fed upon by the air potato leaf beetle. It looks very lacy. If you see that, you can probably rest assured that you don't have to do nearly as much controlling of this plant as you did in the past, because Mother Nature now we have reintroduced the enemy of this particular plant with its insect foe. And here you can see an adult on the underside of the leaves. Sometimes you'll see them at the top side of the leaves when they're during the day as well. And you can see just how skeletonized those particular leaves are in the picture. I have been seeing this more and more throughout Brooksville, here in Dade City, and other parts of both counties. These insects have been widely introduced into the state of Florida in the last 3 to 4 years. Now, we don't have a lot of good biological control of most invasive exotic plants. Part of that is some of these plants are, widely related to other more desirable vegetation, whether it's food crops or what. It doesn't really matter. But they did find in Australia a particular Melaleuca snout beetle that feeds exclusively on the Melaleuca tree or the punk tree. Here is the immature. I don't have a picture of the adult. I apologize, but you folks that are online, you can Google that if you're more curious. Um, Biological control is really introducing either a plant or a disease or something purposefully by humans to control or reduce the pressure of the invasive exotic species. In this case, we're talking plants, but that's also have been done for insects and diseases and other things. Herbicides. Yes, we're going to talk the big C. And I don't mean cancer, I mean chemicals. These are tools in our toolbox. We'll talk more about that in IPM or integrated pest management. But herbicides can be employed and used by homeowners to help in controlling various invasive exotic plant species. Glyphosate. Now you go, what is glyphosate? You probably know it better by the trademark name Roundup. Glyphosate is the generic. Roundup's patent on glyphosate ended in the early part of the 1990s, and therefore many other companies can now manufacture and produce generic versions of Roundup. Glyphosate has been around since the 70s. It is a non-selective herbicide. Non-selective means you should consider it a total vegetation killer. If it gets on the foliage of plants, it'll kill any plant that can absorb it into the leaf tissue, and then it be transported or translocated into the root system and do harm to the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So it's foliar applied. Occasionally we will use glyphosate as stump treatments. When I talked about that in part one with the cut stump, sometimes we'll use glyphosate usually straight out of the bottle or in its concentrated form as a stump treatment. It does not have soil or root activity. Here is a big problem. A lot of people will chop down whatever particular invasive exotic, let's say Kogon grass, and they mow it right practically to nubbins to the ground, with the weed whacker or lawnmower, and then spray the ground really good. I'll hear that a lot. I sprayed the ground really good, and for whatever reason, it did nothing in, harming my Kogon grass problem. Well, the person obviously didn't read the bottle, and which told them, apply it to the leaves. So once it hits the soil, it's quickly what we call tied up or bound by the organic matter and the soil particles. It also is probably one of the fastest herbicides to break down. It has a very short life. Glyphosate is in many, many products. You can find concentrations from as little as 2%, that's usually a ready-to-use type product, to sometimes well over 50%. So when you're comparing price and all that, look at the active ingredient, glyphosate, and if this bottle is 10% and the other one is 20%, depending on the price, one may be a better value than the other. Roundup weed and grass killer concentrate is 18% glyphosate. Roundup weed and grass killer super concentrate is 50.2% glyphosate. And there are many other trademark names for glyphosate. You should know glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide that is foliar absorbed and applied and translocated by the conductive tissue in plants. This is a very important concept to remember as a newbie or trainee. Roundup is the registered trademark name. It is not the name of the active ingredient. Let me just pause for a second and go off a little bit on a tangent, and you can do some homework if you'd like after listening to this. But you can go on to the World Wide Web, Google Roundup, go to their website and see that Roundup now has kind of what I call muddied the waters. They now have Roundup for lawns, they have Roundup Extended, Roundup 365, then they have what we think of as Roundup the original. They have used their very well-known brand name for various active ingredients nowadays. Be very careful with this because what you might think is glyphosate-based herbicide may not be if you just look at the label that says Roundup. I'm waiting for somebody out there in our community to buy a Roundup for lawns or mistake Roundup for lawns to be a selective herbicide versus the original non-selective glyphosate-based herbicide. Mark my words, it's going to happen. Other retail chemicals, a little less known to you and very less likely to be seen on store shelves unless you go to like a horticultural supply house. But rodeo is a trademark name for the aquatic version of Roundup. Yes, we do sometimes use herbicides in aquatic environments. Generally speaking, if it's a natural body of water or a stormwater pond, you as a homeowner are not allowed to apply these herbicides yourself. It's best left to the professional who has pesticide licensing and training. Rodeo, although it's glyphosate, lacks a soap-like surfactant. A surfactant is an aid to either penetrate the waxy cuticle of the leaf, or it helps it stick better to the leaf surface and become what we call weather tight or rain tight within a short amount of time. This makes it safer near bodies of water. Glypro, just one of many trademark names of a generic aquatic equivalent of rodeo. It too lacks that soap-like surfactant, making it safer for bodies of water. Glypro Plus, trademark name of the generic equivalent of Roundup, contains a soap-like surfactant. This can be very confusing to homeowners when they don't know what they're getting. The lack of a surfactant in the Glypro, yes, you could use it on your to kill invasive exotics in your landscape. It's not exclusive to use by water or into water, but without that surfactant, what happens is if we get a good rain and it hasn't been 24 hours, usually that glyphosate is rinsed off the leaf surface. So be careful when you're doing some of your homework with some of these products. Some have surfactants, some don't. Some may, in some rare cases, tell you to add certain types of surfactant. How do you know? You've got to read the label. I can't give you a hard and fast rule of thumb on this one. Again, the Glypro Plus has this soap-like surfactant to help adhere the herbicide to the leaves and or penetrate that waxy leaf surface. Let's go back to the rodeo and the Glypro with the lack of the soap-like surfactant. Why is it safer around water? Well, soaps are a great way of suffocating fish. It's interesting how an inactive ingredient is the toxic part of the product to aquatic wildlife versus the active ingredient. A lot of people think it's a lot of times the active ingredient that's the problem. Sometimes it's the inactive ingredient. Keep that in mind. Triclopyr is a broadleaf weed killer. Now, if we go back to our botany, we remember broadleaf plants don't mean they have big wide leaves. It means they have a netted veins in their leaves, and their vascular tissue is arranged in rings. Right? Remember that? Okay, that's why we kind of talked about that on day 1 and 2 and whatever number of modules later you listen to. It's a powerful hormone mimic. This is a hormone-like herbicide, and it works relatively quickly. And in small concentrations, like all hormones, do profound things to organisms. Just think of a teenager. It can be foliar applied, or it's used frequently as a stump treatment. It actually is probably a better stump treatment product than the glyphosate based in most cases, if it's a broadleaf plant that you're trying to kill with a stump treatment. Remember, this is a broadleaf weed killer. It will not work on grassy weeds. So putting this on to Kogon grass or ferns probably won't do a whole lot of good. Maybe on the ferns it would, I'm not quite sure. Now this one remains active in decaying vegetation for about 3 months. So if somebody wants to get rid of or try to control an invasive plant, this may not be the best answer if they want to try to plant something in that area in a short amount of time. It may be better to choose the glyphosate, which is tied up by the soil particle and rapidly broken down. Keep this in mind when we're choosing herbicides. Now there are several trademark names of triclopyr. Brush Be Gone is one such trademark name. I think that's the Ortho Corporation. It's also known as Brush Be Gone, Poison Ivy, and Poison Oak and Brush Killer. And it contains 8% triclopyr as the concentration of the active ingredient. You may have been at the Home Improvement Center and seen a product called Vine X. Obviously, by the name, it's trying to get you to buy it for vine control. Now, Brush Be Gone can also be used for vine control. The only difference between the two is one is 13.6% active ingredient and the other one is 8. So it means that you're going to have to use more of Brush Be Gone than you will of Vine X in your dilution. If you have a large area of invasive exotic plants that are broadleaf plants, it may be better to buy a bottle of this called Garlon 4. This is usually available at horticulture supply houses. Garlon 4 is 60% triclopyr. Obviously, that's going to be diluted down much more so when it's a foliar used chemical. Let's talk about how to read a label for a moment. First of all, what would the manufacturer want to tell you? The ingredients. Look at the active ingredients. You will find time and time again the active ingredients in many different trademark name products on the store shelf. I like to give a kind of an analogy to it. It's kind of like when you have a headache and you go to the drugstore and you see a whole big block of pain killing medication. But if you look at the various active ingredients, you find that there's relatively few available to the homeowner or over the counter. One is aspirin. Well, that's made by Bayer and many other companies and many generics. So we got aspirin, salicylic acid. You have ibuprofen, Advil, Motrin, and many other trademark names and many generic names out there as well. But ibuprofen. Then you have naproxen sodium. That's Aleve, and there's generics of that. After that, I can't really think of too many other active ingredients available over the counter for pain relief. But we see many different boxes of and bottles of pain-killing pills. It may be that some herbicides have different formulations. We won't go into a lot of details here. Some have different base inactive ingredients, but that's a little bit off track of where we need to go with this class. It'll have directions on how to use it, what it's useful for, where, personal safety information. Most of these will tell you to wear closed toe shoes with socks, long pants, long sleeve shirt, and waterproof gloves. It'll have various hazard information. For example, it may tell you to keep it away from so many feet from aquatic environments. It'll also tell you how to properly store and dispose of it. The application rate called for on the label and 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 mixing are the maximum legal rates. So if it says 1 ounce to a gallon, that's the maximum one a person can add to a gallon of water is 1 ounce. So legally, people cannot use more than what is stated on the label. Legally, you can use less. However, using less usually doesn't give the desired results. And this is true of also beyond herbicides, but insecticides and many other chemicals. So we talked about various techniques in part one, just kind of on a a side note, but we'll get into some of the more common ways we control invasive exotic plants. One is the cut stump. If you look at line number 5, the plant is cut there, and then the outer periphery, if it's a dicot, remember where the vascular tissue is of a dicot, it is painted directly to the outer portion or the ring where the conductive tissue is alive. That's called a cut stump method. I'll show some pictures in a minute. Other times we may apply it like it's trying to show in labeled 2, it's applied to the leaves or the foliage of the plant. I would probably not generally spray a big tree like the diagram shows foliarly to kill it. I would cut it down and use a painted stump or cut stump technique. The hack and squirt is generally something we won't do or recommend for homeowners, but line number 4 shows what kind of is going on. You take a hatchet, you make a couple of cuts in there, and then you squirt a concentrated amount of the appropriate herbicide into that wound, and then the plant translocates it to where it needs to go and kill it. This is used like on Melaleuca in the Everglades. Basal bark application is primarily used by professionals. We won't go into that, but if you ever hear that, that's really a professional technique. Cut stump is usually used on woody species that normally resprout after being cut. Remember, you are breaking apical dominance many times on these plants, and where there once was one tree, you get a forest of them or a thicket. And it's easier to treat one stump appropriately with the proper herbicide than a whole bunch of little ones that have come up weeks and months later. It can be applied to cut stumps with a spray bottle. I usually recommend paintbrushes. I'll show you why that in a minute. It has a very low probability of contaminating the environment because you're putting it right where it needs to go, and it's done in a very precise, a small amount will go a long way because most of these cut stump treatments are, generally speaking, there may be exceptions, read the label, you use it straight out of the bottle. So it is a small amount, but it's a concentrated amount of the herbicide for this to be effective. Also, in this cut stump method of treatment, you need to cut and then treat within a short amount of time. In other words, you want to cut down a whole bunch of invasive exotic trees, cut for 20, 30 minutes, then paint, then, go back to cutting, painting. Don't cut all day long and then go in the house, take a shower, lie down, and then 2 weeks later paint. That area will have sealed up or calloused over and won't take up the herbicide. This is where a lot of failures happen in the cut stump treatment. People wait a day or two and that has sealed over and won't take up the herbicide anymore. So here's a cut stump application with a paintbrush. Here is the gentleman or lady has, notice this picture where he or she is applying the herbicide with the paintbrush out of probably a cup to make it easier to dip the paintbrush in. It is on the outer periphery, just under the bark where the living conducting tissue of a dicot plant is located. So he or she is applying it within that inch or two of the outer periphery of this particular dicot tree. I don't know what it is, but it's a dicot. If you only have one plant to treat, even a tree of that size, I probably, because most homeowners don't want to run out and buy yet another bottle of product, most people have Roundup and concentrate at home. So a lot of times for one or two or just a few amount of plants, I'll recommend that they use Roundup straight out of the bottle. It is labeled for that if you read it. Or Roundup is also known as by what generic active ingredient? You should know what that's called. Take a moment to think about it. Glyphosate. Now, if they have a lot of trees to cut down that are dicot, I would go with Garlon 4, which I mentioned, also known by the generic equivalent triclopyr. It also is a formulation called Garlon 3A. It's a slightly different molecule. It's an amine versus an ester formulation. That's getting too technical for this class. Is triclopyr. Brush Be Gone is a trademark name available in a pint or half a quart or something like that bottle of triclopyr. That is a far better stump or cut stump treatment herbicide for dicot plants. Whole bunch of herbicide is going to do diddly squat. So this is an improper technique in drilling holes. Don't do it. The basal bark or the hack and squirt are very similar. Sometimes certain plants, the bark is thin enough that herbicides containing triclopyr, Garlon, Brush Be Gone, etc., can actually penetrate through the thin bark. Other times a hatchet will be employed to make a wound and then squirt the concentrated herbicide into the plant stem. Notice the gentleman is wearing a suit. It may be required by the label for the technique he is employing, or maybe he's using additional personal protective equipment because he doesn't want that on his work clothes and have to worry about that contaminating the laundry. Also notice he's wearing gloves. Foliar applications, again, you have to be careful. This is obviously a professional trying to treat what appears to be either old world climbing fern or Japanese climbing fern, and he's applying a foliar application of a foliar absorbed herbicide. I'm not sure if he's using Rodeo or Roundup or Garlon or some of the others that are out there. But the problem is if that spray, and it's a non-selective herbicide, gets onto any desirable vegetation, it could be damaged or killed in the process. Generally speaking, for vines, you have to be very careful. Foliar application on vines applied the herbicide to the foliage of actively growing plants. Notice I added the word actively growing. Sometimes some of these plants go kind of quasi-dormant in our winter months, or during periods of drought they may go dormant and not absorb it. Also notice that I mentioned in part one that some herbicides work better after the plant's expended a lot of energy to produce no new growth in the spring and the summer to produce flowers in, let's say, the fall. So it may be a timing as well. Uh, if it's a vine and you can carefully spray it, do it uniformly and completely. The more herbicide that gets on through the leaves, the better. Don't mow down the vines first and then spray the ground. It doesn't work. Avoid getting herbicide onto desirable plant foliage. I've been known in my younger days, when I was getting paid to do this, is to painstakingly dab with a sponge. My hands had gloves on it that were waterproof, and painstakingly dab on each leaf on vines with glyphosate to kill vines that were growing on desirable vegetation. I was getting paid to do that. I probably wouldn't do that in my normal personal life. Also, a big problem in controlling most invasive exotic plants is the lack of plan to retreat when new uh, vines, or for that matter, regrowth of these particular invasive exotic plants occur. Best management practices. Herbicides are often used as a last resort. Consider delaying herbicide application if heavy rains are forecast for the next few days, especially if it's one of these products that lacks a surfactant to glue it on the foliage. Or you're going to do a cut stump treatment and we're expecting to get a hurricane, wind named event. If you're using a foliar applied herbicide, avoid it when it's windy. Much over 5 miles an hour, some of these can drift. Roundup is less likely to drift and cause problems, as is the triclopyr based herbicides, which Because it's a powerful hormone mimic, a small amount can do profound things. Avoid contamination of surface and or groundwater. Don't spray it directly into a body of water, most herbicides. Be mindful of other non-target plants. Now, let me grab my script. You hear the paper? All right. So here I have in front of me the 2015. I couldn't get the 2017 to print at the day of recording. Florida Exotic Pest Plant Council's 2015 list of invasive exotic species. I'm reading this. You can go and click on the website and get their list. And here is the purpose of the list: to focus attention on the adverse effects of exotic pest plants on Florida's biodiversity and native plant communities, the habitat loss in natural areas from exotic pest plant infestations, the impacts on endangered species via habitat loss and alteration, the need for pest plant management, the socioeconomic impacts of these plants, for example, increased wildfire. We talked about that with the old world climbing fern and the Japanese climbing fern, or flooding in certain areas. Melaleuca might be one such plant. Changes in the severity of different pest plant infestations over time, providing information to help managers set priorities for research and control programs. Oof. All right, so that's a lot of what the list was designed to be. Now they have various levels of Invasiveness, Category 1. Invasive exotics that are altering native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structures or ecological functions, or hybridizing with natives. We talked about that with lantana. This definition does not rely on the economic severity or geographic range of the problem, but on the documented ecological damages caused. And they have a whole list of various plants. One is rosary pea. I mentioned that earlier. They have, just going down here, they have carrotwood. We mentioned that earlier. They have Dioscorea bulbifera, air potato. That's right, very good. Water hyacinth, and many others that we can all agree on. Japanese honeysuckle. Then they have category 2 invasive. These are invasive exotics that have increased in abundance or frequency, but have not yet altered Florida's plant communities to the extent shown by Category 1 species. And here's the key to Category 2. These species may become ranked Category 1 if ecological damages are demonstrated. And they have a whole bunch of plants that are listed here, including, among others, queen palm. Okay, so a lot of people get a hold of these, the Flepsy list, and then start shaking it in front of us, an extension, or you as a master gardener, and say, why do we recommend queen palms when it's on the invasive list by Flepsy? Like I said, the Flepsy group is a wonderful group of people, some of whom I know, but their lists are not being used properly either by some groups of people. We use the UF IFAS assessment list. This is the home page. It's not a concise list that you can print off, unfortunately. Maybe one day it'll be so. But here you can search by species name if you know it. You can also do it by common name. But be careful of common names. As we have learned, patient Lucy's may not pop up in patients, which is the scientific genus of that particular plant. So you may have to cross-reference it with a good guide. But we use the IFAS assessment list. And queen palm is not listed as an exotic invasive plant. But you can see right on the home page, rosary pea is. So again, when in doubt, use the UF IFAS assessment list to help people. Is it an invasive exotic or is it not? Now, are the Flepsy list and the IFAS assessment list regulatory? No! In case you didn't get that by the big font. No, they're not regulatory lists whatsoever. So what is regulatory is usually the next thing. There is a federal noxious weed list, and you can Google search that as well as I can. There are certain state laws against certain particular plants. Surprising, the federal and state lists are relatively small and few in number of plant species. Then there are in some cases local laws or ordinances. I'll use my home county of Hernando. Hernando County several years ago passed an ordinance requiring county residents to control. They probably were using the word control, the people that rattled the cage loud enough and often enough to mean eradication, but we'll call it control. Brazilian pepper, which isn't very widespread that far north in Hernando, it's primarily along Hernando Beach, and lead tree, which I did not talk about in part one of this. You can Google that, but it's another invasive exotic tree. And those two now have an ordinance regulating them. Homeowners can have certain liens and things on their property if they're not controlling it by the county. Pasco County does not have any local ordinances that I'm aware of at this time banning any particular one species of plant or species of plant. Also note that even though these lists are regulatory, the federal noxious weed list and the various state laws, most of these are not very well enforced, to be honest. Kogon grass is on the state list of invasive exotic plants, but you can see how well it's controlled throughout this state, right? So there's some bark out there, but sometimes there's not a lot of bite. Didn't say everything was perfect on this planet, did I? Here is just a snapshot of the federal noxious weed list, and there's various plants on there. And if you go the third from the bottom, Imperata cylindrica, you go across, if you can see where I was, Imperata cylindrica, Kogon grass. Yes, it's on the federal noxious weed list. But even with the federal noxious weed list designation doesn't mean it's getting widespread control. So you can print this off or search these for the various lists that I've been referring to. Of course, the one we use is the IFAS assessment. That's the first web page link at the top. You can look at the FLEPSI list again, know what it was designed for and what it's not meant to be either. It's a tool, but people are using this tool improperly. Then you can see the federal noxious weed lists and the state lists. The federal noxious weed list is the third link down with the USDA.gov, and then the HTTPS, etc., is our state noxious weed list. You can see what's all on there, but you can also see how well or not how well control is being done on a statewide or federal level. Please don't shoot the messenger when it comes to us talking about some of these plants. Some people get very upset when you say, what's wrong with my Mexican petunia? You're like, it's a weed. Please don't plant it. And they want you to fix the problem, and you're trying to kindly get rid of them somehow. But again, it's an invasive exotic. Sword ferns, erect sword fern I talked about. Some of these I didn't talk about, but again, a lot of these were brought here for ornamental value or for potential for food crops for us, or for that matter for wildlife, or for not wildlife but livestock. So again, some people get upset when some of their prized possessional plants are being attacked, or we generally don't recommend being grown in the state of Florida, or Central Florida for that matter. Well, hopefully that wasn't too painful. This is going to end our talks on invasive exotic species, some identification and control. Remember those herbicides.